G'day, I'm Ian Smith and I've just finished building all the hatches and deck furniture on my 24-foot Ranger class gaff-rigged sloop. I'll be talking about the tow rails and upper sponsons, the Companionway sliding hatch, the skylight, the fore hatch, the cockpit coamings and trim, and the cap rails. Most of the other ranges have very simple hatches and only 2 others have skylights, but I decided I had to have one. Like most of the other ranges in the fleet, I'm using spotted gum for the sponsons and tow rails, and Queensland maple for the coamings, cap rails and cockpit trim. I considered also using Queensland maple for the hatches, as most of the other boats originally had, but most of them have been replaced in recent decades with teak. I love teak, but there's a lot of money involved, and a fair bit of that ends up in the hands of the murderous thugs running Myanmar, so I looked around for alternatives. I settled on New Guinea rosewood, not a true rosewood, but a durable timber that's stable when seasoned, and more importantly, it can be brought back by sanding if the varnish ever deteriorates, just like teak. Queensland maple, on the other hand, will always retain a stain if allowed to deteriorate. I'll let you in on a little secret. Parts of my hatches, like the ridgepole of the skylight, the sides of the fore hatch and the coaming of the fore hatch, are actually Australian rosewood, an unrelated timber, but I had some beautiful pieces I'd been saving for years with the same qualities as the New Guinea rosewood, but more rare. Let's just say, like the Shakers, I put it in as a deliberate mistake because only God is perfect. Now, this boat's not designed to cross oceans, so I decided to go for a butterfly skylight on this one. Skylights notoriously leak at sea. Sometimes even rain, but more often waves breaking over, spray and solid water will get down a hatch, and they're often considered a misery. They're often covered over with a canvas cover pulled tight, sometimes with plastic panels perhaps let in for the light to come in. But there's not much use for an opening skylight if you can't see through it and can't open it. In order to help keep the water out, the traditional design has a groove right along the ridgepole on each side on the hatch side, so that any water that gets in there runs into there and simply runs out at the end. Of course, they're yet to have their glass and protective bronze rods fitted across the top. There's a protruding dam that presses on compressive foam in a groove under the hatch leaves. The hatch can be propped open and dogged down with these catches. Years ago, when my son and I built our Lyle Hess 24-footer Serenity, we took a different approach. And this is a much more seagoing skylight. It doesn't actually have butterfly windows that come up. It's a solid hatch that gets dogged down. The skylight also has hinges that can come apart, so the whole hatch can come off. It's dogged down over a foam rubber seal. And I haven't yet got a stay to put in there, but we usually shove a fender if we want it open wider, or something soft like a cushion if we want it, or we can just prop it on the dogs like that for a little bit of air. The fore hatch also is just a solid teak structure that gets dogged down on a frame. But I also installed a lifter on each side on these ones to prop it open. On the Lyle Hess boat, I also built these teak deck hatches, which are terrific for storing warps, fenders and so on. But I don't have room for them on the Ranger. This is the simplest form of combing, with a single piece sitting directly on the deck and a trim piece on the inside to cover where the deck edge would appear between the beam and the combing. They're just let into each other on the corners, just halved on the corners. They could be dovetailed. I halved these corners and let them into each other, fastened them as well, fastened them down, and added a corner piece in each corner for strength. Combings for hatches also vary according to how waterproof you want them. On the Lyle Hess we used a simple rebaited combing, but an even more waterproof design is to have a double combing, though it does reduce the size of the hatch opening. Most of the ranges have this style of forehatch. It's a great aid to ventilation. This bit's permanently open for ventilation. You can also turn it around 180 degrees so that it scoops the breeze on an anchor. Now, you wouldn't use a hatch like this on a seagoing voyage, but this boat's not going to sea a hell of a lot, and on a mooring it's absolutely ideal. Now, this is the sliding companionway. It slides along on these brass strips. There's lots of different ways you can construct this. Lots of different methods for supporting it while it slides. Several different methods for retaining it to stop it being lifted off or floated off or whatever. This one's still a little bit stiff. I like them to be that way early on because a little bit of wear and tear will make that easier. But you don't want them too tight. Once the boat gets in the water, the increased humidity in the environment usually means that timber will swell up differentially and the hatches will get tight then. Planning a companion hatch gets quite complicated, especially when you build a skylight into the system. This should really all be worked out before you put in the deck or cabin top beams. This is the retention system designed by Chuck Payne, and I used this first when I built a 26-foot Francis design 20-something years ago. There needs to be a notch in the forward section of the rail so that the hatch can be removed. From Lyle Hess, I got the idea that the forward parts of the rails should be lower than the aft parts, so water can't flow or be blown along the rail under the hatch. Oh, and the hatch rails need to have scuppers for water drainage. I also got this idea for a simple locking mechanism from Chuck Payne. The seagoing hatch on my Lyle Hess 24 is built to a much greater curve, but still slides in a similar manner, with the brass strips in the side sliding in a slot. And we've got the same brass sliding pieces that can come out through here when you need to take it off. We'll go back and go through how I built each item more or less chronologically. The spotted gum sponsons were steam bent around the gunnels before the deck went on, just roughly cut to shape. The final rounded shape is a copy of that on most of the other boats in the fleet. It's not just a simple round over, it looks way better to be shaped something like this. To get this shape, I used spar making principles. I marked and planed a series of flats, then planed the ridges for more flats, then kept planing and finally sanding to make the shape smooth. I backed up the 60 grit sandpaper with a foam block. I find that using a flat backing pad speeds up the removal of ridges, but I always turn to the curved side for the final rough sanding and use that to back up the finer grades of paper. The companion hatch rails are continued forward to be the sides of the skylight. These rails need to be scribed and fitted to the deck. I use temporary cross pieces to get the exact distance apart. I marked for the 3 permanent cross pieces, the dam at the forward end of the companionway opening and the 2 ends of the skylight. The forward end is dovetailed to the rails and the other 2 are notched in. I machined up the skylight ridge pole and bedded and screwed it in place. Planking for the 2 hatches is jointed on one side, with the other side sawn to the very slight angle needed to fit together over the curve. I then used a biscuit cutter to make a continuous slot for a spline that stopped short of each end. I machined and dry fitted the plywood splines to check the fit. I always dry fit anything that's going to be glued together first. The ends of the planks need to be slightly hollowed underneath to fit the curve of the rails. I used this old block plane with a curved blade. The sawn edges are finely planed to fit against the previous plank. I used long clamps to get the planks as tightly together as possible. I numbered each part, then disassembled them and began to glue it all together. Next day I sanded the glue dags off, then trimmed the ends, then faired the top with a hand plane. Here's a trick with a batten and chalk for finding the high spots on a surface like this. Then I scribed the stock that makes the curved handle. The skylight needed a groove routed in it to take the dam that helps keep it watertight, as well as a groove under the lids to take the foam. I also fixed up the cockpit hatches. This is a flush cockpit hatch, so I can get into sails or whatever under the cockpit seat. Now at some stage this is bound to leak water. Now there's a gap through there and along the back. I've got the compressive padding in a line around the edge there that compresses on that ridge around there, which actually is what it lands on. But there's also a drain. A very shallow drain here, a deeper drain aft, and then sloping drains that take the water down to holes in the front of the cockpit. Now they are long and they are sloping deep, so that any water that comes in here, even when the boat's heeled that side, will still be able to come out through those holes. This one's the lazarette hatch. It also might leak around the edges there, so it requires drains as well. So it drains through there. There's compressible foam along there which presses against this ridge, and that's where the weight of the hatch actually lands. There's a drain all the way around that slopes slightly forward and comes out in holes just under here. They don't need to slope as much as the side deck ones that allow for the boat heeling. That will drain quite comfortably by itself. These hatches are a pretty distinctive feature of the Rangers. They come out easily to give a good light and airy feel to the cabin. I screwed and bedded the upper sponsons on, then I machined up the tow rails. The spotted gum wouldn't take the curve of this very full deck line, so I made up a pattern of the curve of the deck edge and used it to steam bend the tow rails on the bench. But I'm afraid I forgot to film this. The tow rails are screwed down with their outer edge just overlapping the sponson deck joint. Some of the boats located their tow rails further inboard, but this leaves a narrow deck edge section that complicates painting and varnishing. I made up a pattern for the cockpit coamings because I only had 2 suitable wide boards of Queensland maple and I didn't want any mistakes. Except that I also forgot to film much of the process, but here's a shot of the port coaming dry fitted. This curve didn't need to be steamed. There was lots of bulkhead trim and other cockpit trim to be machined, fashioned, fitted, and then bedded and fastened. I also forgot to film making the cap rails, but I can show you that I also used a pattern for this. All the Rangers have these cap rails, but a couple of them simply use a flat piece with rounded edges. It's more work and you need thicker material, but a shaped cap rail looks far better. Spar making principles also apply here. Make a series of flats and then remove the ridges. I cut the sideways curve from wider stock using the pattern, but the vertical curve was just bent down using clamps and wedges before screw fastening. Then came the cleaning up and the sanding. I sometimes think the job description of boat builder is wrong. It should be boat sander, judging by the amount of time we spend sanding. And then there's the varnishing. I did 12 coats of all-wood MA, 3 coats a day and sanding each morning and before the final coat. And finishing all this is a big milestone. Next time I'll be talking about how I made the pattern for the ballast keel. Thanks for watching and I'll see you then.